Welcome to the Proceedings podcast. I'm Bill Hamblet, the editor-in-chief of Proceedings at the U.S. Naval Institute. It's Friday, January 27th, 2023. Good to have you on board, everybody. Today, we're going to be talking about distributed maritime operations. This episode is brought to you by Blue Cross Blue Shield. Vision coverage. What makes good vision coverage? Things like fully covered vision care exams for all members, access to over 125,000 independent providers and national retailers. That's why you should choose Blue Cross Blue Shield FEP Vision. Plans start as low as $12 a month. See what we can do for you at bcbsfepvision.com. Well, my guest today is Captain Tom Clarity. He's joining us from Newport, Rhode Island, the Naval War College. Tom, great to have you on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Bill.
All right, so Tom is an EA-18 Growler weapons systems officer, ECMO. He commanded a Growler squadron VAQ-131. He served as the operations officer on board the USS Ronald Reagan CVN-76, based in Japan, and now he's a professor in the Joint Maritime Operations Department at the Naval War College. And we got him on the show today to talk about his article in the January issue of Proceedings, which is titled Distribute DMO to the Fleet. Distribute DMO to Tactical Commanders. I am getting over COVID, and that is an example of COVID brain fart. But Tom, this is a great article. Great to have you on the show. Great to have you writing in Proceedings again. Let's just start with this question. So distributed maritime operations, what is that and what's it intended to do?
Thanks, Bill, and thanks for having me on. I'll start with the standard preamble that all of my thoughts, comments, words are mine alone. They're not official U.S. Navy policy. They're not official Naval War College policy. But broadly, DMO is identified as the central operational concept for the U.S. Navy in the Chief of Naval Operations 2022 Navigation Plan. Kind of break it down, the basic premise is that you disaggregate and you disperse forces while preserving the ability to aggregate combat power generated from those forces via networks and command and control architecture. As an operating concept in the current age of persistent surveillance and long-range anti-ship ballistic missiles, it makes complete sense. But it's also dramatically different from kind of the model that you and I likely deployed under with the standard carrier strike group composite warfare commander model. Now that model, the carrier strike group composite warfare commander model that you and I deployed under in the past, made a lot of sense in context of the Cold War and continues to have some applicability. When you had to rely on an air wing to deliver your striking power for a nuclear response option, it made sense to layer in protective measures around it. You know, that curtain of steel that you could be afforded with your destroyers and your cruisers to protect the carrier from a submarine, a surface, or a inbound air threat while preserving the carrier striking power. Made perfect sense. Against the People's Liberation Army rocket force, we probably need to do something different, hence DMO. And in trying to unpack kind of the historical root of DMO as a modern concept, the first thing I could find in Proceedings really was a 2015 article by Admirals Roden, Guamatoto, and Fanta, writing about distributed lethality as an operating concept for the surface fleet. And then in 2018, Admiral Richardson presents DMO and Design 2.0 as a broader, more, I think, platform agnostic concept for maritime operations. Both concepts, I think, in some way kind of leverage an earlier concept that was established by Admiral Zabrowski with network-centric warfare. There's a lot of commonality between them. But long and short of it is, Hey, you don't have to have hulls operating in close proximity for them to be mutually supportive from a combat perspective. If you can integrate those sensors and weapons from greater distances apart, it makes the targeting of your own forces much harder to accomplish.
Yeah, it's a great point about the difference between carrier strike group operations, specifically in the last 30 years when we didn't have to worry about sea control. It was kind of a given. We didn't have too much of a threat that was going to reach out and touch a carrier strike group, and the threat that could, you could mitigate by having your Alpha Whiskey, your DDGs and cruisers close in, right? But now, if you are aggregating that carrier strike group, you're presenting a large target out at sea, and that's a part of this problem. So you write in your article that DMO as a warfighting concept hasn't really reached the tactical level yet. It hasn't filtered down to tactical commanders, to individual ships and squadron COs or air wings, that kind of thing. So as a warfighting concept, has it been developed at the operational level well yet? And is it understood at that level? Is it understood and discussed and modeled, at the War College or in the maritime operations centers?
Yeah, I'll start at the tactical level, because I believe that, while we nest our understanding of levels of war and objectives, if we're doing it properly from the strategic through the operational down to the tactical, there's still a bottom-up understanding that has to take place. So when I was writing this article, the original opening had a pretty long and ponderous description of a series of events that I had experienced at the War College. Readers may say, well, your opening is still long and ponderous, but, opinions may vary. But the genesis of the article was having these really smart, really talented, command-screened, crewed-as surface warfare officers from the U.S. Navy who, when I talked to them about DMO, couldn't really talk about it in any well-informed way. And these were smart men and women. They are smart men and women. I could ask them, hey, if we have a ASW threat, if we've got a submarine, array a carrier strike group. Here are 4 destroyers, 2 cruisers, and an aircraft carrier. Show me where you would put those forces. And they could do it. If it's a inbound air threat, what would you change, if anything? Okay, what if it's a surface action group? What would you change, if anything? And not only could they do that and do it, I think, well, they could explain the reasoning behind it to a class of non-surface warfare officers. And when I would say, okay, now for doing distributed maritime operations, array your forces. And I just got looks, just very blank looks. So at the tactical level, I don't think that they've got a mental picture of what this should look like. At the operational level, I think I would offer 2 things. One, I learned pretty early on in my naval career that I was not the smartest guy in the room. So I am confident that we have some very smart people who are working on some of the issues that I've identified, particularly at the operational level on Navy staffs and at our warfare development centers. And I think that they are working through how this would be implemented. But to some degree, it doesn't really matter if we understand this really well at the operational level of war if there's no tactical understanding. There has to be a commonality in vision. We look at it as one of the preconditions for mission command is understanding, shared understanding, and trust. 2 things that deform rapidly if there's no understanding of the why behind why you're being told to do something. So in a comms permissive environment, the operational level, this could be nailed, and the tactical level doesn't really need to understand it. In a comms denied environment or a comms contested environment, we have to make sure that our tactical level leaders understand why they should do what they're being told to do or directed to do. And in the absence of being told that they are conditioned to take the initiative to act appropriately.
Yeah, that's a great point. So you offer an example from nature of how DMO might work. Can you explain that for our listeners? Heather's going to show the diagram from your article as we discuss it.
Yeah, to go back to, talking to these smart SWOs who couldn't tell me what this looked like. I'm like, well, I can't tell them what it looks like either, because I don't have a useful model, a visual model. I could tell you, again, I could tell you how to array forces in a carrier strike group. I could tell you what a division of growlers, what their spatial relationship should be like, depending on a mission area. I could talk less intelligently about what that would look like for, our fighter aircraft and our Hawkeye. But I had nothing for DMO. And I was on a walk with my wife, because I'm in a job where, fortunately, I can occasionally take walks with my wife because I'm not at sea. And there was this mass formation of birds in a farmer's field. And it's a murmuration of starlings. And I didn't walk by and say, oh, look at that murmuration of starlings, because I didn't know the word murmuration existed. And I certainly didn't know they were starlings. But it looked like it was like an avian air show. I'm seeing this formation of hundreds of birds. And they're operating in a really dynamic formation. It's condensing at times, it's disaggregating, it's reorienting its axis, but it's still maintaining some idea of central coherence throughout the entirety of the formation. Like, there's an idea that they're all working together towards some unknown purpose. And, God knows what it is. It's a bunch of birds flying around the field, but they're all flying around together. So I did some research into what that phenomenon was, because I'm like, this kind of looks like it would work. It kind of looks like it makes sense. And I found it was called a murmuration. Fortunately, there was a Princeton-trained mechanical engineer who had studied like hundreds of hours of tape of these formations to determine, what are the rules here? What keeps this from just being a blob of birds flying together? Why is it so different from, that relatively static V-shaped formation that you see from migratory birds? She determined there are basically three rules that govern this. There's an attraction zone that says, like, hey, don't get any further away from this. There's a repulsion zone that says, don't get any closer to your next bird neighbors. And then there's a angular component of fly in this general direction. And in the process of studying this behavior, what I found fascinating was it's not a mass formation like we would think about it. Like bird 22 isn't concerned with what bird 143 is thinking about. No, they break it down. It's a amalgamation of a bunch of local formations. It's 7 birds. You've got to care about 6 wingmen. And that's it. But who those 6 wingmen are is determined by proximity and angular relationship. So it allows for this to be, exceedingly dynamic. And after writing the article, I found that there are other scientists that are trying to use these same general principles to determine swarm technology for unmanned aerial systems as well. So you can replicate that same sense of dynamism while also preserving coherence. So with that in mind, I'm like, yeah, this kind of works.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Part of that, you mentioned this already. You mentioned mission command, and I would imagine it's important even down to the individual starling level, right? That level of trust, understanding what their wingmen are doing, understanding what the mission is, and what the overall purpose is. And so mission command is important. It's important to any mission in the Navy, really, but I think especially DMO is going to highlight that if you, as you pointed out earlier, in a comms denied environment or a comms limited environment, we're not going to have perfect knowledge of what our boss wants, and our boss isn't going to understand what we're doing and all the things that we're seeing. And we're not going to be able to constantly communicate and ask questions and get updates, right? So that trust, that mission command aspect is incredibly important. So talk about that for a minute, if you would.
Yeah, because it brings up the question is like, why is mission command so important for DMO? And, I could offer the hypothetical that it's not. Like, in a perfect C2 world, do you need mission command? No, maybe not. If the subconditionals there are, is C2 going to be perfect in terms of quality of decision making? Is the connectivity going to be preserved around the clock without interruption, knowing that we are looking at an adversary who's going to target C2 nodes, both kinetically and non-kinetically, jamming, cyber, munitions inbound? In the world where we don't have to worry about that, then yeah, you could control the fleet and move them around the chessboard as required. But that's not the world we live in. And that's just the technical side of this, right? The other side is the cognitive side, which you brought up. How able are subordinate commanders when we have to have them execute things that they don't understand? Like, go here and do this. Well, why? That's a natural part of the human condition, and it's probably an exaggerated one for our national character. Like, we want to know reasons why, and we don't just listen mindlessly without any context. And beyond just the CEOs, like our critical watch standers, they want to understand what the intent is behind their actions. So even if you overcome the technical challenges, I don't think that you overcome the cognitive challenges unless you're controlling a, unmanned fleet. The reality is that we know that C2 is never perfect. And even perfect systems don't account for everything. They don't account for, C state. What's the impact of fatigue on decision making? Where do you have talent? Where do you have strength? Where can you galvanize a force to potentially exceed its own capabilities? So for me, we need to have subordinates that, in the absence of further orders, understand your general intent and can still execute something that looks like our concept of DMO with very limited communications.
Your article includes a sidebar that is the Fleet Admiral King's 1944 war instructions. And what made you include that? And can you talk about some of the lessons from Admiral Ernest J. King that still apply today?
Yeah, since I was a student here at the War College for the junior class back in like 2013, I've had a printout copy of Synclant serial number 053 from Admiral King, talking about initiative and the habits of the service, where, and it's fascinating to me because it was written in January 1941. And King is already talking about and really complaining about the increased tendency of commanders to reach into the quarterdecks of their subordinate commanders and tell them not just the why, but the how and the what. Saying, like, hey, guys, you are crushing the disciplined initiative and creativity that we need out of these subordinates when it comes time for us to actually get into a fight. So that stuck with me. And, I've got my I Love Me binder as recommended to me by my lieutenants when I was a midshipman, with all my fit reps and, paperwork. And that's on the front cover of it, just to remind me. And then King follows it up and is remarkably consistent with how he prioritizes human initiative with the war instructions in 1943. Again, talking about the the human aspect of these conflicts. And the reason I think it's valid today is it's been valid throughout all of recorded history. Clausewitz's consideration of the human element of war is what breaks him out from his peers and probably preserves his place in our consideration today as a military theorist. And it's something that we're not moving away from. Even with semi-autonomous systems, there's still generally going to be human in the decision-making process. And understanding how we get the best out of that individual is distinctly commander's business, and something that we need to capitalize on as one of the few asymmetric advantages that I think we enjoy in the U.S. Joint Force. We have fantastic human capital, and we have really smart, really creative people who, if we give them access to a baseline concept of DMO, they can start really fleshing it out. You asked earlier about, hey, do we teach this at the War College? And yeah, we discuss it with other emerging concepts like ACE and EABO. But I find myself kind of spoiled for content when it comes to EABO, because Marines are writing about EABO. And it's not just Marines on staff that are directed to write this thing, try to get it published, get it out. They are, as a force, I think, trying to put a lot of meat on the bone here when it comes to this concept, and working through the ins and outs of, okay, if we're going to forage, how do I do site surveys for foraging? What should the proper composition and weapons loadout be for a Marine Littoral Regiment? And it's great. For DMO, I'm a lot more limited with what I can actually present to a class and ask them to consider, just because I don't think that the fleet's been wrestling with the concept in the same way that the Marines have been working through EABO. And it makes me think of an article that Proceedings published by Trent Hone about intellectual readiness. And it's valid because a lot of U.S. Navy innovations in the World War II era were bottom-up driven. They had clear objectives, they had baseline tactics, but there was plenty of room for innovation from guys like Flatley and Thatch and Burke, because they understood the broader concept, but they had room to really think through the tactical execution.
Yeah, what you just said reminds me of two conversations I've had recently. One was on the EABO and the Force Design 2030 that the Marines are going through. One of our foundation board members, retired 4-star Marine general, was curious about, because there's been a lot of, particularly in the Marine Corps Gazette, there's been a lot of debate about whether Force Design 2030 is a huge mistake or not. This Chowder II Society, et cetera. And we haven't had the Chowder II Society in Proceedings, but we have, so one of the things we did for our CEO was come up with a list of all the articles in just the last couple of years that have debated Force Design 2030 and EABO in the pages of Proceedings. It was dozens that's lowballing it. It was probably more than 50 articles, right? And some of them are positive, some of them are kind of neutral. Some of them are, say, hey, I guess this is what we're doing. Have you thought about this, that, and the other thing, right? Have we thought about logistics? Have we thought about movement to contact? Have we thought about the mixture of infantry Marines versus, those that are going to be, currently artillery, but moving towards, naval strike missile and those kinds of things. But we've been publishing a ton of it in Proceedings. And I can't remember, other than the admiral, the piece by the 3 admirals that you mentioned in 2015 on distributed lethality, Guma, Tau Tau, and Fanta and Rowden. And your piece, I'm not sure that we've published much on DMO, right? It's just hasn't been an article. There haven't been a lot of things written about it.
Yeah, and that's the second reason probably why I decided to write this. One is because I wanted something that could be potentially useful to my students, but the other was with the full understanding that, hey, there are going to be gaps and holes in anything I write. We just need to get the conversation started. I think we as professional naval officers, you can't rely on a staff officer who is getting burdened with the daily responsibilities of trying to manage a fleet, or our fleet commanders to come up with some magic secret that's going to be unveiled in the event of war. It's our responsibility to think through this concept and poke holes, suggest improvements, or provide alternative ways of looking at this, or just add to the concept as a corpus so we can execute it if we have to.
Yeah, it's a great point. And the role that Proceedings plays, sometimes people will criticize an article, that it doesn't provide all the answers. And my answer to that is always, there's very, very few articles in Proceedings that have been the alpha and the omega on any particular topic. But what the value is, as you just pointed out, is getting the conversation started. And then other people read that and go, yes, or, well, I'm not so sure about that. And have you looked at it this way? Right. And then you get the follow-on articles and you get the discussion going and you get the debate. And then we get some of those authors to come and present at an event. You do a panel discussion, right? Where we have 3 or 4 authors who might have different views or perspectives on a particular issue. So yeah, it's very important. On a related topic to that, I do want to point out to our listeners and viewers that you're the vice chair of the Naval Institute's editorial board. So you and about 10 or so other volunteers, active duty Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, E9 to 06 right now, serve on our editorial board, help us vet all the content, particularly the feature articles that we publish in Proceedings. I just wonder if you could talk about that for a minute from your perspective of being a member of the editorial board and what that entails.
Yeah, I can first start off with kind of how I got there. I started writing for Proceedings after my time as a student in the junior course. So as I was a prospective XO, CO, and then a little bit through my XO and CO tour and then subsequent tours. And I was fortunate throughout my naval career in having some very talented friends, including one who served on the editorial board, Brendan Stickles. And as he was nearing the end of his time on active duty, he was like, hey, I think you would be a good fit for this. So I rode his coattails into my introduction to the board and was fortunate enough to get a slot. And it's great because the board composition is officer, enlisted. You've got Coast Guard, you've got Marine Corps, you've got some mariners, SWOs. So it's a nice cross section. And now, having been removed from the sea-going fleet for 2 years, it's a great point of connectivity for me because not everyone on the board is. We have people who are, in operational roles who are fitting in board meetings as best as they can, or people who are on major staffs, and they provide me with insight into issues that are impacting the fleet, as do a lot of the articles that we're receiving as well. Because, you know what it's like. You start losing currency on the operational fleet the second you cross the brow and you step on dry land again. So it's been a great sounding board and a great way for me to see, hey, what are the compelling arguments that are taking place now? And it gives me the opportunity to read some really interesting writing. And what I love probably more than other things is when I see things come from junior personnel, because that sense of buy-in and ownership to the process and the future of our naval services is something that I believe to be really encouraging.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I served on the editorial board back, almost 30 years ago now, in the mid 1990s, and I was a JO at the time, and it was a life-changing opportunity for me. But I'm 6.5 years retired now from the Navy, so without the editorial board, without you all and your contacts too, right? So that's a big part of it, is that we get a lot of stuff, and I stay as current as I can. But sometimes it's like, I'm just not sure that this is the most up to date. And if somebody on the editorial board doesn't know, they know somebody who knows, right? You know somebody who's currently in command or flying a type model series, or or is on the numbered fleet staff where that thing is being experimented with, or is, the concept is being developed, and that contact that you all have across the 3C services is vitally important to the relevance of proceedings.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add is I don't think that we're constrained by we're not the be all end all of this discussion point either. The frequent refrain is the author has a right to be wrong, which doesn't mean they're objectively wrong. It means that they may have a different presentation from what we'd like to see, or arrive at a different conclusion. And I think that there's a substantial enough humility on the board to understand it's like, well, the author could be right and we could be wrong as well. And that disagreement doesn't equal disloyalty to the naval service. It's good to have some of those articles where it's like, man, I really disagree with this argument, but it's logical, it's coherent, it's readable, it's well researched, and it's worth presenting to readership so that they can engage it. And maybe they're going to poke holes that we don't recognize, or maybe that's going to be something that readers find really compelling and agree with the argument.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. It's a great point. Authors have a right to be wrong. We do. We say that in our editorial board quite often. And wrong is not in all caps. Like, they could be wrong from what the current position is, but maybe that is the right decision, or the right way to look at it. Yeah. Before we sign off, any parting shots or saved rounds? What's happening up in Newport this week?
We are getting ready for our next trimester teaching the junior course, Joint Maritime Operations. I'm obviously a very biased source, but for any junior officers or department heads who are looking at their next set of orders, I'd highly recommend you put the Naval War College on your list of desired destinations. Again, my opinion, not official Naval War College policy. My time here as a student was absolutely life-changing in terms of preparing me for my command tour. It gave me an opportunity to read and reflect, not just on the material that's presented, but on, at that point, 13 years of experience as a naval officer. And we get pretty wound up in the tyranny of the now, I think, when you're in an operational unit. And you don't get a lot of time to revisit previous decisions that were made by your CO, by your department heads, or even by yourself. And having the space to reflect on those decisions and reevaluate them with the added benefit of maturity and a little bit of distance, I found to be very, very useful and very helpful as I went into squadron command. So that's my plug for the Naval War College, my parting shot.
That's a good plug.
And read Proceedings.
Yeah. Well, Tom, thanks for your time today. Thanks for writing for Proceedings. And I do hope that your article does generate more follow-on articles and comments. Looking forward to the comment discussion section for the February issue to see if we've got anything coming in on your article. Just updating that. What is DMO? How do I take a murmuration of starlings, as you put it, and start to conceptualize and turn that into actions that could be taken at sea by ships and destroyers and warfare commanders, et cetera. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see.
Well, thanks, Bill, and thanks for having me.
All right. I'll see you next week at the Ed Board meeting as well. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Proceedings podcast, brought to you by Blue Cross Blue Shield Vision Coverage. What makes good vision coverage? Things like fully covered vision care exams for all members, access to over 125,000 independent providers and national retailers. That's why you should choose Blue Cross Blue Shield FEP Vision. Plans start as low as $12 a month. See what we can do for you at bcbsfepvision.com. If you enjoy the show, like us, subscribe to our channel, tell your friends, become a member at usni.org/join. And until next week, remember, victory begins at the Naval Institute.